What's going on, guys? Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about how radical responsibility will change your life forever. I'm talking about taking 100% responsibility for every single thing in your life. All the good parts of your life and all the problematic parts of your life. Assuming responsibility for all of them. All of your issues, all of your hardships. I literally mean just everything. This is a very radical concept. I know most people have strong resistance to this idea, to this notion that we are indeed 100% responsible for everything in our lives. But stay with me. I'm going to tell you why that's true and why adopting that principle is going to change your life forever. I'm going to start with the story about a man named William James. Although born into a wealthy family, William James had terrible problems, life-threatening health problems since birth. He had trouble with his eyesight. He was actually blind for a portion of his childhood. He had terrible hearing problems, and he had back spasms so bad that he would often not sit upright or stand upright for days at a time. He was confined to being horizontal, lying down. Because of his health problems, William spent most of his time at home. The only thing that he would really do and kind of enjoy was paint. Unfortunately, as William got older, he was really the only one that thought he was a good painter. Nobody bought his work into his early adulthood, and his father started giving him a really hard time about being lazy and not being talented. He was living in the shadow of his siblings who were quite successful. William's dad pulled some strings and got him into Harvard, into medical school, and he hated it. William had no interest in being in medical school, but he did it just to get his dad off his back, and he felt like a fraud. A few years later, he dropped out, and to avoid dealing with his father's wrath, he ended up going on an expedition in the Amazon. Now, this story is taking place, this is a real story, by the way. It takes place in the 1860s. So any transcontinental travel was pretty dangerous and pretty time-consuming. Surprisingly, in the face of all of his health complications, he actually did manage to make it to the Amazon. But as soon as he got there, he contracted smallpox, and his back spasms started giving him a lot of trouble again, and he had to get left behind by the group. He was all alone in a foreign land, practically on the verge of death, and had to find his way back home. Amazingly, he ended up getting back home alive, but as the only constants in his life seemed to be depression and hardship, William began to contemplate taking his own life. As he was contemplating suicide, he decided that he was going to conduct a little experiment for himself. For the next 1 year of his life, he was going to take 100% responsibility for every single facet of his life. No matter what the circumstances were, how bad they were, he was going to do everything that he could to change them and make them better, even if the chances at failure were very high and the chances at succeeding and changing those circumstances to more favorable ones were very, very low. If at the end of 1 year, his circumstances didn't seem to turn around and his life didn't seem any better, he would go ahead and take his own life. If you recognize the name William James, you already know how this story turns out. William went on to become one of the fathers of American psychology. He taught as a Harvard professor, toured America and Europe giving lectures, had 5 children and a successful marriage, and attributed all of his success to his little experiment of taking 100% responsibility for everything in his life. One of the pinnacles of self-help is recognizing that by taking 100% responsibility for everything, you are empowering yourself to begin to make changes where you see fit. Responsibility yields power. There's a famous quote from the fictional Spider-Man character, Uncle Ben, that says, "With great power comes great responsibility." But it seems to be more apparent that with great responsibility comes great power. By taking responsibility for everything in your life, what you're doing is taking the first step to solving any and all of your problems. The opposite of taking radical responsibility is having a victim mentality, pointing the finger everywhere else for our problems, and therefore not telling ourselves that we have any power in changing it, which sets us up for, in the short term, a sense of relief and entitlement, but in the long term, a miserable life full of a victim mentality. Now, I want to make a very, very important distinction here. I am not saying that there's no such thing as a victim. I am not saying that you are to blame for all of your problems. The most popular objection to this notion that we're 100% responsible for everything in our life is that a lot of our problems are out of our control. and we just can't do anything about them. And surely we can't be to blame for everything. If I get robbed, how is that my fault? There's no way that that's my fault. There's a lot of really bad situations that people find themselves in that are very, very traumatic and that can leave a lot of scars. And they can leave a lot of problems in our life as well. I'm not saying that you're to blame for all of your problems. That's absolutely not the case. The mistake that people make in this objection of how can you say that we're 100% responsible for everything in our life? We're not to blame for everything. You're conflating responsibility with blame, or responsibility with fault. And those are two completely different things. If I get robbed at gunpoint and now I'm a little bit traumatized, that's not my fault, obviously. However, I am now responsible to decide, number one, in the moment, I'm responsible to decide how to act. But afterwards, I'm responsible to decide what to do with that experience that I just had and that new trauma that I have just received. I can go to therapy and I can resolve that trauma. That's a decision that I'm responsible for making. Or I can ignore the fact that I've just been traumatized and go on to let that trauma impact my life in very negative ways. See, I'm responsible for choosing how to deal with the experience that I had. Responsibility really just comes down to choices. We are always making choices whether we know it or not, whether we're choosing consciously or not. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. And yes, I just quoted Rush. So when I say we're 100% responsible for everything in our lives, including all the problems, that doesn't mean that you are to blame or you are at fault for all of your problems. But by assigning the fault elsewhere and simply focusing on how it's this person's fault so that I have that problem, if I leave my focus there instead of saying, okay, I'm now responsible for dealing with this issue that I have, I'm never going to resolve it. And I'm just going to be resentful thinking about how everybody's out to get me. And it could be very, very true that you're a victim in a situation, but that doesn't mean you're not responsible for dealing with the experience that you just had. So it's really important to not have a victim mentality with regards to our problems. Because like I said before, accepting responsibility for our problems, no matter who is to blame or who is at fault, is the first step to solving them. And remember, fault and responsibility are not the same thing. They're completely different. Every individual is 100% responsible for their own life and all the problems in their life. But that doesn't mean that they're 100% at fault or to blame for all their problems. But I want to make a point here. The irony behind the objection of, oh, this problem isn't my fault, or somebody else is to blame for this problem that I have, the irony behind that objection, while sometimes that is true, in most cases, that's such a self-deceptive way to think about your issues. And in most cases, that's actually not the case. You are the one that is responsible, even in the context of blame and fault, for a lot of your issues and your problems. Usually where you think somebody else is to blame for your problems, it's really a co-creation that you and that other person have created. You've co-created a problem in your life. Your hands aren't clean in most of your own problems. To give you an example, maybe you're in a marriage and you find yourself unhappy in your marriage. And you've communicated the issues in your marriage with your partner, but they're just not seeming to want to resolve them. They're not taking you seriously in your communication, and they're kind of just behaving the same way anyways. There's no changes being made. And a relationship is just kind of mediocre because of it. You might think that that is a problem that you have and your spouse or your partner is to blame for that problem. If we're looking at who's to blame though, you could have left that relationship. You could have made it perhaps more clear that these are things that are non-negotiable for you in a relationship and there are needs that you have that aren't being met. Or perhaps you haven't really even communicated anything. You haven't voiced the issues that you're finding in your relationship. And so you think that, oh, here's all these ways that they behave and that's like a problem for me. And that's causing a problem in our relationship, but it's not my fault. Well, have you ever considered actually communicating that you find those problematic? You find those things that you don't like to be sort of deal breakers in your relationship. Now, it's not actually that important to think about who is to blame in this sense. That's such like a shallow, petty ego game in most situations, unless we're talking about like a court system. But it's important to acknowledge how we're responsible, or how we're at fault, rather, for some of the issues that we have in our lives, so that we can learn from our mistakes, so that we can know how to not keep manifesting those same problems. And there's usually so many little choices, little decisions, very subtle things that we do that will yield a lot of our problems that we don't even recognize. But as I was mentioning before, even if you are not to blame and there wasn't anything that you've done that has brought about a problem, which is rarely the case, that your hands are completely clean in the manifestation and the creation of your own problems. But even if that is the case, you are still responsible for them, in the sense that you can now respond to actively seek a solution for your issues. So it's very important to drop the victim mentality. I'm not saying that there's no such thing as a victim, but there's a difference between being a legitimate victim in a situation and behaving with a victim mentality. Sometimes we're a victim, but it doesn't mean that we should just sit around and point fingers at everybody else all day and not take responsibility for how it is that we are going to solve the issues that we now find ourselves with. That is the best route to take. That is the route that you're going to take that is going to actually help you find resolve, and that is actually going to let you live free of any traumas and the problems that you find yourself with, rather than living very resentfully and feeling powerless and feeling like you have no control over any of the circumstances in your life. Because you do. You have a lot more control over the circumstances in your life than you think you do. So some very practical, tangible ways that we can begin to be responsible for 100% of the circumstances that we find ourselves in our life is to firstly make that perspective shift that I just laid out for you. You're not necessarily at fault or to blame for all of the circumstances in your life, but you are responsible in the sense that you have to now decide how it is that you're going to move forward with your circumstances in the best ways, in the ways that are going to yield the most solutions and the most progress towards your desired destination. After you've made that perspective shift, which hopefully you have after watching this video, you can go ahead and ask yourself some questions when you find yourself in circumstances that you are actively being responsible for. And those questions are, firstly, how did I contribute to the manifestation of this? And that's going to help you learn the lesson that the circumstance is trying to show you. And if you did play a role in creating the circumstance and the situation, and you find it unfavorable, there's a lesson there for you to learn. So find out how you created the circumstance that you find yourself in and learn from your mistakes. Now, as I said before, it's not always going to be the case that you have actively played a role in the creation of those circumstances. So maybe the answer is, this is how I created these circumstances, and I'm gonna try not to do it again moving forward. Or maybe the answer is, I had nothing to do with it. In any case, you're gonna try to answer that question first. I had nothing to do with it is still an answer, but that's rarely going to be the case. So try to be very, very honest with yourself about that. The next question you ask yourself is, okay, now that I'm here, what can I do moving forward to solve this problem? And that's in your hands. You're going to have to try to swim in that water with the most emotional intelligence that you can and the best problem-solving skills that you can. But ultimately, those decisions are going to be up to you, and hopefully you handle them in a good way that doesn't yield more problems and only yields you some solutions. That's it for today's video, guys. Like I said, Uncle Ben got it wrong. With great responsibility comes great power. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, be sure to give it a like, subscribe to my channel for more content like this, and let me know what you thought in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care. Have a good one. See you in the next one.